Picture a guy who can recite every player stat from the last decade, quote entire scenes from a show word for word, and tell you the exact release date of something that doesn't come out for 2 years, but ask him how he's actually doing and he goes completely blank. Today, we're getting into why some men retreat into fandom, how avoidance quietly becomes identity, and, maybe most importantly, how to tell the difference between genuine passion and fear wearing a jersey. By the end of this episode, you'll have a real framework for understanding what's actually going on, and maybe recognize it in someone you know. My co-host has been deep in the research on this one, so let's get into it.
So the first thing worth saying is that fandom itself is not the problem. Like, at all. The psychology of fandoms is actually rooted in some of the most fundamental human needs we have. Belonging, identity, connection, escapism. These are not small things.
Right, and I think that's the nuance that gets lost when people dismiss fandom as like a guy thing or a nerd thing or whatever.
Exactly. And the research backs that up hard. According to social identity theory, which psychologists have been working with for decades, we categorize ourselves into groups to build self-esteem and connection. Fandoms are just one of the most accessible and low-barrier ways to do that.
So it's not just liking a thing, it's actually doing identity work.
That's exactly the language researchers use, identity work. A 2022 paper published in the Sports Innovation Journal by Chun and Sagas at the University of Florida actually laid out a whole framework called Integrated Fan Identity, which looks at how collective identity, role identity, and personal identity all interact in fans. It's not one-dimensional.
Okay, so walk me through what that actually looks like in practice. Like, what does it mean for your identity to be fused with a fandom?
So there's a concept called identity fusion theory, and a paper published in Frontiers in Psychology in June 2025 specifically examined this in sports fans. The idea is that personal and group identities can actually merge. They stop being separate things. So it's not just, I like this team. It becomes, I am a fan of this team as a core part of who you are.
And when that happens, questioning the fandom feels like a personal attack.
Exactly. The 2025 Frontiers paper specifically noted that identity fusion creates a powerful motivational force where fans prioritize the group's welfare as their own. Which sounds kind of beautiful in theory, but it also means the boundary between self and fandom gets very blurry.
And I think that's where it starts to get complicated, right? Because there's a version of this that's genuinely healthy and a version that's not.
Yeah, and the Oxford Handbook of Media Psychology actually has a chapter on exactly this, the psychology of fandom and parasocial experience. What's interesting is that fandom was originally studied through a lens of pathology. Researchers thought it was weird, obsessive, concerning, but the field has shifted to understanding it as normal and even positive social interaction.
Wait, so the academic world used to think being a hardcore fan was a sign something was wrong with you?
Pretty much. And honestly, that tells you a lot about how cultural assumptions shape what we even bother to study. But the shift happened because researchers started seeing that fandom creates real community, real resilience, real well-being outcomes.
And there's actually data on that, right? Not just theory.
Yeah, a 2025 peer-reviewed chapter published through Intech Open in a volume called Advances in the Psychology of Wellbeing analyzed data from 167 participants and found significant correlations between fandom engagement and well-being. And here's the part that's really relevant to what we're talking about today. Men specifically showed higher levels of social connectedness through fandom than other groups.
Okay, that's actually kind of striking. So for men, fandom might be doing more social heavy lifting than we realize.
That's the thing. And it flips the easy narrative that fandom is a retreat from connection. For some men, it might genuinely be the primary place they feel connected at all.
Which is both kind of heartening and also a little bit alarming, depending on why that is.
Right, and that's the question we actually need to sit with. Because the why changes everything.
Before we get into the why, I want to just ground this in something concrete. Because when we talk about fandom, we're talking about a massive range of things. Sports, gaming, anime, Marvel, K-pop. The scale of this is kind of wild.
It really is. And the intensity can be staggering. Team Lewis published a piece on the psychology of fandom that mentioned hardcore Taylor Swift fans in Argentina camping outside a stadium 5 months in advance just to secure a spot at the front. 5 months.
5 months. That's not a hobby. That's a lifestyle.
And Dr. Michael Bond, who wrote a book called Fans, A Journey into the Psychology of Belonging, frames it exactly that way. Fandoms offer a sense of community and shared identity that goes way beyond just liking something. It's about finding your people.
And I think that's actually a really important thing to hold on to as we get into the harder part of this conversation. Because the need to find your people is real and valid. The question is, what happens when fandom becomes the only place a man feels safe enough to do that?
That's the crux of it. And to understand that, you have to understand what's happening with male emotional socialization. Because it's not random that men are retreating into these spaces.
So break that down. What's actually going on?
So there's a concept in attachment psychology called the intimacy fear paradox. The framework comes from work by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth on how early relational experiences shape adult behavior. And what it describes is this: closeness feels good until it feels threatening. The closer you get to someone, the more vulnerable you become. And for men who've been conditioned to equate vulnerability with weakness, that exposure can feel genuinely destabilizing.
So it's not that they don't want connection, it's that connection starts to feel dangerous.
Exactly. And the research on avoidant attachment describes it this way: many men who pull away show signs of avoidant attachment, which does not mean they don't care. It means intimacy activates subconscious alarm systems. The closer he feels, the more exposed he becomes, and so he pulls back.
And fandom becomes the perfect workaround for that, doesn't it? Because you get belonging without the vulnerability.
That's exactly it. Fandom offers what you might call controlled belonging. You're part of something, you have an identity, you have community, but nobody's asking you to be emotionally transparent. Nobody's asking you how you're really doing. You can just talk about the thing.
And the thing never rejects you.
Right. The show doesn't leave. The team doesn't stop being your team. There's a stability there that real relationships can't guarantee. And for someone who's been hurt or who's afraid of rejection, that's incredibly appealing.
Okay, but here's where I want to push back a little, because I think there's a real risk of pathologizing something that might just be a preference. Like, some guys genuinely just love their thing and aren't hiding from anything.
That's a completely fair challenge, and it's actually the most important distinction in this whole conversation. Because you're right, genuine passion is real. The NeuroLaunch piece on fandom psychology makes the point that for many individuals, being a fan becomes an integral part of how they define themselves in a healthy way. It provides purpose and belonging.
So how do you actually tell the difference? Like, what are the signals?
So the research on social withdrawal from Verywell Health, which was reviewed by a licensed mental health counselor and medically reviewed by a physician, lays out some really useful markers. Social withdrawal linked to fear looks like this. It's connected to shame, low self-esteem, and fear of rejection. It tends to compound. The more you withdraw, the more isolated you feel, and the more you need the fandom to fill that gap.
So it's a loop.
It's a loop. And the Verywell Health piece specifically notes that social withdrawal can be a symptom of underlying conditions like anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, or personality disorders. It's not always just a preference. Sometimes it's a signal.
And I think the tricky part is that from the outside and even from the inside, it can look identical to just really loving something.
That's the thing that makes this so hard to navigate. The behavior looks the same. The guy who's genuinely passionate about gaming and the guy who's using gaming to avoid his life can look exactly the same from the outside. The difference is internal. It's about what the fandom is doing for him.
So what questions do you even ask to figure that out?
The research on identity construction in fandom. There was a literature review from the 2021 International Conference on Public Art and Human Development points to something useful here. It found that fans construct idealized selves through performance in fan communities. So one question is the fandom helping him build a self, or is it replacing the work of building one?
That's a really sharp distinction. Building a self versus replacing the work of building one.
And another signal is defensiveness. When someone's fandom is genuinely healthy, they can take a joke about it, they can engage with criticism of the thing they love, they can hold it lightly. When it's doing identity protection work, when it's shielding them from something, any challenge to the fandom feels like a challenge to their entire sense of self.
Because of that identity fusion thing you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The 2025 Frontiers in Psychology paper on identity fusion theory specifically noted that when personal and group identities merge, it creates extreme loyalty and what they call self-sacrificial actions, which in a sports context might mean flying across the country for a game. But in a personal context, it might mean sacrificing real relationships to protect the identity the fandom provides.
Okay, that reframe is kind of uncomfortable in the best way, because we celebrate that level of dedication in fan culture. Like, that guy who flew across the country for the game is a legend, but the same psychological mechanism might be what's keeping him from showing up for the people in his life.
And that's not a condemnation of fandom, it's just an honest look at what the same psychological drive can produce, depending on the underlying need it's serving.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about emotional socialization, because I think that's the piece that explains why this shows up more in men specifically. Yeah. The research on male withdrawal describes it really clearly. From childhood, boys are often taught to suppress emotional expression. Cultural conditioning rewards independence, stoicism, and control. So when closeness starts to demand emotional transparency, some men experience genuine cognitive dissonance. They care, but they've been told that needing someone is weakness. And instead of processing that tension, withdrawal becomes the easiest strategy.
And fandom is a socially acceptable form of withdrawal. Nobody's going to tell a guy he's broken for being really into his team. Right, it's actually celebrated, which is part of what makes it such an effective hiding place.
The NeuroLaunch piece on fandom psychology makes the point that fandom provides escapism and emotional regulation. It's a respite from daily stressors. And that's genuinely valuable. But there's a difference between using something to recharge and using it to never have to face what's draining you. Recharging versus hiding. That's the line.
And the Very Well Health piece on social withdrawal makes a point that I think is really actionable here. It says that social withdrawal can significantly impact relationships, as well as physical health and mental well-being. It's not a neutral choice. When avoidance becomes the default, it compounds. The isolation deepens, the anxiety around real connection grows, and the fandom has to work harder and harder to fill the gap.
So the fandom escalates because the need it's covering escalates.
That's a really good way to put it. And that's when you start to see the more extreme behaviors, the guy who can't miss a single game, who gets genuinely distressed when a show ends, who structures his entire social life around the fandom. It's not just passion at that point, it's dependency.
And the Oxford Handbook chapter you mentioned, the one on parasocial experience, actually addresses what happens when that dependency gets disrupted, right? Like when a show gets canceled or a team has a terrible season.
Yeah, the Oxford Handbook chapter specifically acknowledges what it calls parasocial breakup, the repercussions of losing the connection to the object of fandom. And for someone whose identity is fused with that fandom, a parasocial breakup can feel like an actual loss, which tells you something about how real the psychological investment is.
That's actually kind of clarifying in a weird way, because it means the feelings are real, the attachment is real, it's just pointed at something that can't reciprocate.
And that's the core of the parasocial relationship concept. The fan feels a genuine connection. The object of fandom doesn't know they exist. And for someone who's afraid of real intimacy, that asymmetry is actually the appeal. All the feeling, none of the risk.
All the feeling, none of the risk. That's a really clean way to describe it. And also kind of a sad one.
It is. And I want to be careful here not to make this sound like a judgment on the men who are in this pattern, because the research is clear that this is often rooted in conditioning and early relational experiences that they didn't choose. The attachment frameworks from Bowlby and Ainsworth show that how we relate to closeness as adults is shaped by experiences we had before we had any say in the matter.
So it's not a character flaw, it's a learned response.
A learned response that made sense at some point and then got generalized. And fandom is just one of the more socially invisible places it shows up.
Okay, so let's bring this to something practical. If someone is listening to this and they're recognizing either themselves or someone they care about in what we're describing, what does that actually look like to work through?
The first thing is just the recognition itself. Because the research on identity construction in fandom shows that fans create idealized selves through performance in fan communities. And that's not inherently bad. It can be a genuine step towards self-understanding. The question is whether it stays there or becomes a bridge to real connection.
Does the fandom open doors or close them?
That's the diagnostic question. And the Intech Open study found that fandom fosters collective resilience. It can actually build the capacity to handle difficulty. So the potential is there. The fandom itself isn't the enemy. It's whether the person is using it as a launching pad or a bunker.
A launching pad or a bunker. I love that.
And the Very Well Health piece on social withdrawal makes the point that identifying the causes of withdrawal is key to addressing the broader health effects. So it's not about telling someone to stop loving what they love. It's about asking what the love is doing for them and whether there's something underneath it that deserves attention.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what I keep coming back to. Fandom is genuinely powerful. The research is clear on that. It builds identity, it creates belonging, it fosters resilience. For men specifically, the Intech Open study found it drives higher social connectedness. That's real and it matters.
And the history of fandom research shows that we've been too quick to dismiss it. The Oxford Handbook notes that the field moved away from pathologizing fandom for good reason, because the benefits are documented and significant. The community, the shared purpose, the emotional regulation. These are not small things.
But here's what this really comes down to. When fandom becomes the primary identity, when it's doing the work that real relationships and real self-knowledge are supposed to do, it stops being passion and starts being protection. And the tell, according to the research, is whether it opens you up or closes you off.
And the intimacy fear paradox is the thing underneath all of it. The research on avoidant attachment shows that men who pull away aren't doing it because they don't care. They're doing it because they do care, and that caring feels dangerous. Fandom offers a way to feel connected without that danger, which is understandable, and also, over time, limiting.
So the question isn't whether someone loves their fandom, the question is what the fandom is protecting them from, and whether that thing is worth facing.
And the research on social withdrawal from Verywell Health is pretty direct about what happens when avoidance compounds over time, loneliness, isolation, impacts on both mental and physical health. The cost of not facing it is real. It just accumulates slowly enough that it's easy to miss.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started. The guy who knows every stat, every lore detail, every release date, but goes blank when you ask how he's doing. The question isn't whether he loves the thing, it's whether the thing is loving him back, and whether he's letting anything else in.
And if you're someone who recognizes that pattern, in yourself or someone you care about, the starting point isn't to blow up the fandom, it's just to get curious about what's underneath it. Because the capacity for that level of devotion and passion, that's not the problem. That's actually the asset. It just needs somewhere real to land.
That's a genuinely good place to sit with. Thanks for being here for this one on Copilot Podcasts. If this episode made you think about someone, or made you think about yourself, that's probably the point. The fandom isn't the enemy, but it might be worth asking what it's standing in front of.